Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this snowy evening in Massachusetts. I hope you're all warm and cozy tonight. Tonight, we will explore the role of women in aviation and aerospace and learn about their accomplishments, obstacles, and their enduring legacy in all areas of aviation and aerospace, from the first woman to solo a balloon in the 18th century to Bessie Coleman's dream to establish a flight school, to the woman who briefly called the International Space Station home. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Carey Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Carey Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like today's event to you. I would also like to thank the public libraries in Marlborough and Tewksbury for partnering with us on this program. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Sara Fisher is the Executive Director at the International Women's Air and Space Museum. Before coming to the museum, she ran one of the only two history-focused AmeriCorps programs in the country. Since 2013, she's worked with more than 40 history museums in Ohio to better serve their communities, care for their historic collections, develop interactive programming, establish strategic planning, and more. Sara is actively engaged with the Ohio Local History Alliance, America's Association for State and Local History, and National Council on Public History. In 2018, she served as Impact, Relevance, and Engagement co-team lead for the StEPs Enhancement Project, which brought together professionals from across the country to update the StEPs, which is Standards of Excellence Program, workbook for small to medium-sized history organizations. She earned a BA in History with the Women and Gender Studies certificate from Ohio University and a Master's in Art in History, concentrating in public history from Wright State University. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for providing this program as part of Women's History Month. I'm very excited to be here. Like was just mentioned, my name is Sara Fisher. I am the Executive Director at the International Women's Air and Space Museum in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. So tonight we are going to explore a very much like pun intended bird's eye view of women's history within air and space. And for many of you, this may be a refresher, if you will, from our history classes, our social studies classes from years past, but we'll also provide an opportunity to explore women's experiences in some of that context of women you may never have heard of. So because we have a lot to go through this evening, I just kind of want to introduce you to the International Women's Air and Space Museum. We have actually been around for 47 years. We officially incorporated in the state of Ohio in 1976 as an education-based nonprofit. And one of the things that makes IWASM, as we call ourselves, unique is that we are the only museum of its kind in the world dedicated to this mission. Okay, here we go. Our mission to collect, preserve, and showcase the history and culture of women in all areas of aviation and aerospace. And that's very much important in everything that we do. That, you know, everyone may have heard of Amelia Earhart. If you haven't, you've been living under a rock. But everyone has heard of Amelia Earhart, but you may not have heard of Bessie Coleman or Willow Brown or Mary Golda Ross, all of whom were either pilots, engineers, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and so much more. So that's what we're really here to do, is to preserve, educate, and inspire our communities about women's roles in all areas of air and space, both in the past and also those who are making history today. We are located inside an active airport in downtown Cleveland, Burke Lakefront Airport, which is the official reliever airport for Cleveland Hopkins, our main airport hub. And there we take up about 2/3 of the airport concourse. We are, if you ever get a chance to come out to Cleveland, we are free of charge, 7 days a week, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And this picture here on the slide is actually our newest exhibit. It was funded thanks to a grant from the Ohio Humanities Council, the affiliate for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And It opened October 2022, featuring the stories of women in our early space program here in the US, spanning the 1950s, 60s, and ending with the class of 1978, the first to allow women and minorities. So you can see here just some of the current exhibits. We do also on our website have a virtual exhibit that launched in, when was that? June 2021. We launched our very first virtual exhibit entitled Defying the Odds. So some of the women's stories from that virtual exhibit are reflected in tonight's program, but there are many, many others that we are working to incorporate into programs as well as our educational offerings. As a museum, we offer quite a few different programs. And for those of you who are joining us who are there in Massachusetts, we offer these in a hybrid format for the most part. So these programs, such as our Dinner with a Slice of History, which we have one coming up next Friday, featuring Sandra Durbin, who was the first Black female air traffic controller in the US and US Navy in 1967, and is currently the California commander for AMVETS. So she is coming to share her experiences and the work that she's doing even today in service of her fellow veterans. So we do have that offered in person as well as live via Zoom. So if you go to our events page on our website, which you can see in pink here on the screen, you can sign up for that. We'd love to welcome you. And if you are on a road trip, spring break, anything like that, and you're able to come out to Cleveland, we are also hosting our second annual trivia night with our partners at Southern Tier Brewing Company in downtown Cleveland. We also offer a variety of programs for our K-12 students that align with state and national education standards, as well as offering, our WOW Wings of Women STEM conference for middle and high school aged girls in the fall. So you can always sign up for our e-news. I can provide my email address at the end if you're interested in learning more. So without further ado, let's kind of dive in to tonight's topic. So tonight's topic is really exploring the roles and impact of women in air and space. Now, for many folks, we tend to associate this fascination with aviation and even our current space program with really starting in the 20th century, in the 1900s. But for those of you who may be familiar with pre-mechanization, pre-industrial revolution, we have gliders and we have balloons. And women have had a place and a role and an impact in ballooning and gliding since the beginning. They've been a part of it. Men are the ones that tend to get the airtime, the press, but women have been there right from the start. Two women in particular were Elizabeth Tibble and Jean Labrosse. Elizabeth Tibble was from Great Britain, and Jean Labrosse was from France. And you can see here the dates, and the dates are in the 18th century. They are before Ada Lovelace, famed human computer and mathematician, was even born. She was born in 1815. But these two women are two that are credited with being the first woman in a lighter than air activity, Elizabeth Tibble, and Jean Labrosse, who was credited with being the first woman to solo a balloon. However, because of the timing and not having the 24-hour news cycle that we have now, there are conflicting records of who actually was the first. And based on the research and everything that we've done at the museum, extensive research, because everyone wants to know, well, who was the first? Well, we have record of a woman named Sophie Blanchard, who is on the left-hand side of your screen. She actually is the earliest record that we can find. As early as 1776, yes, the same year as the Declaration of Independence here in what would become the United States, she's credited with being the first woman to pilot a balloon. So not only the first woman to take part in a lighter than air activity, Elizabeth Tibble, or the first woman to solo a balloon, Jean Labraz, Sophie Blanchard is the first credited with piloting a balloon. Well, that just further goes to show just kind of how early this fascination and this hobby, this leisure activity was starting to take hold within our society. Sophie Blanchard was married to a fellow balloonist, and she was in France. She actually became friends with none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. She actually, she was able to, gain quite a bit of fame and respect for being such a gifted pilot. That one account says that Napoleon Bonaparte made her how best do I say this? He kind of gave her the role of director of balloons and ballooning there in France, and tasked her with figuring out how to invade Great Britain using balloons. Now, these balloons, they're not like the balloons that we see in the iconic pictures and video from, say, like the Albuquerque balloon festivals. They were not that. They didn't come into vogue, if you will, that new modern hot air balloons until really the second half of the 19th century, 1880, 1890. So when Napoleon tasked Sophie Blanchard with figuring out how to invade Britain, the balloons couldn't go very high. You were tethered oftentimes to the ground. You had very little control. It's pretty much you go up and you go down. Well, that's not going to really help you if you're trying to cross the English Channel, where weather patterns change drastically, and you have to deal with this danger. So it never happened, but you start to see leaders changing their mindset. How do you use this new activity to use it for a different purpose? You saw that in the United States during the American Civil War, where the Union Army actually utilized the balloon corps. They used these balloons to spy on the Confederate Army during the Peninsular Campaign, Island Number 10, the Savannah Campaign, as well as the Battle for Chancellorsville. It would not be until 1880, after we start to see the Industrial Revolution coming here to stay, that we see American Mary Myers becoming the first woman in the United States to solo a balloon. And then by 1903, and the Wright brothers' successful flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, that we start to see new mechanization. And while ballooning is still a fun, enthralling activity, we start to see interest shift a little bit. So why is this all important? Well, women were working within different areas of early aviation. So what's happening within Earth's atmosphere from at least 200 years ago, almost 250 years ago, if you're thinking about Sophie Blanchard, because as the United States, we're going to hit the 250th anniversary here in 2026. So 3 short years away. It's kind of mind-boggling. But we've all heard of the Wright brothers. Now, the Wright brothers, they are the Ohio boys. Ohio has the claim that we are the first in flight. Well, they had a little sister, and Orv and Will, as I lovingly call them, because I got to go to Wright State for my master's program there in Dayton. They had this little sister who was there for it all. When Catherine was born, she was actually the only daughter of the Wright family. She was the youngest of 5 children, 3 years younger than Orville, 7 years younger than Wilbur. And they had 2 older brothers who, by the time Catherine was born, were already off and starting their own families and their own careers. So the 3 youngest Wrights were very close. They were very tight-knit. And Catherine ended up doing something that none of her 4 brothers did. She went to college and she earned a degree from Oberlin College. And she earned that degree in Latin and the classics, because Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, was, from its establishment, one of the first colleges or institutions of higher education that admitted both male and female students. So upon graduation, Katharine went back to Dayton, began teaching Latin at Steele High School, and in 1903, she was with one of their older brothers, Lorne, in the bicycle shop, staffing the bicycle shop while her brothers were down in Kitty Hawk. And they got a telegram back in Dayton saying, it worked. We did it. So Katharine, while she herself never throughout her life became a pilot, she actually was she played a supporting role. She would have, in my opinion, the Oscars were last night, she would have won Best Supporting Actress, if you will. But her support of her brothers wasn't just there supporting them by staffing the bicycle shop. She also, in 1909, accompanied her brothers on their European tour. And while on that tour, Orville and Wilbur just really wanted to talk to other inventors because they were folks who were working on modern mechanized flight at the same time that the Wright brothers were. They wanted to compare notes. They wanted to brainstorm. They wanted to nerd out with people who spoke their language. They didn't want to talk to the press. They did not want to talk to, folks like you and I. So that's where Katharine stepped in, and really she leveraged her teaching background to be able to translate the detail and the intricacies of this new Wright flyer so that, yes, there was enough technical, but there was enough of everyday folks that she could engage with. And while in 1909, during that European tour in Pau, France, Wilbur actually took Katharine up on the Wright flyer, making Katharine one of the first women to be a passenger on a plane. She was a suffragist. She was heavily involved in the League of Women Voters in Dayton. She served as a trustee later in life for Oberlin College. And she also was an integral part to the patent disputes that arose in the 1920s, where other inventors, like Samuel Langley, for instance, began asserting that, no, they had that first mechanized flight, that first modern flight. And it was Katharine's notes and her record keeping, as well as her insight that really helped Orville at that time. Wilbur had died of typhoid fever, but helped Orville win those patent disputes. So now we know Orville and Wilbur Wright were the first in modern flight. So Katharine's story is indicative of everything that we're doing here at the International Women's Air and Space Museum to share the stories of women in all areas of air and space. So you don't always just have to be a pilot to have a place in aviation history. You don't just have to have exited Earth's atmosphere and be an astronaut to have a place within history. There are so many different roles, and if you ask anyone at NASA, they will say, you can come in with a humanities background, you can be an engineer, you can be a mechanic, you can be really anything and be able to work even for NASA. So that's something that we always want to share the story of Katharine Wright, because oftentimes she has been left out of that narrative. But even Orville admitted that the success that he and his brother had could not have happened without Katharine. So hopefully now you will know and share the story of Katharine Wright. Another early female pioneer within the realm of aviation was Harriet Quimby. Harriet Quimby was from Michigan. She was a photojournalist or a journalist, and she was the first American woman to earn her pilot's license. She was not the first woman, full stop, to earn a pilot's license, but she was the first American woman, and she earned that licensure from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale in France in 1911. She would become the first woman to fly across the English Channel, as well as the first woman to fly over Mexico. Now, one of the things that is interesting about Harriet is that she was able to understand the social implications of being a pilot. Much like even today in 2023, the vast majority of pilots in the world are male. Less than 7%, even in 2023, are women of all pilots across the globe. An even smaller percentage are women of color. So Harriet was able to balance and understand the social implications of playing the part, if you will. So this picture here, you can see, it looks like a typical flight suit. Well, she actually designed this flight suit herself. It kind of looks like she's wearing like some pantaloons or like parachute pants. If you look at it, this was unique because when you're in the cockpit, especially when Harriet was flying, you had to have complete and unhindered use of all four of your extremities. It was a very cramped cockpit and you had to use everything. You can't do that when society expects you to wear an ankle or floor length skirt. So what this flight suit would do is it could actually unbutton around the legs and button up to form a skirt, and then button around each leg, and thus form this active flight suit. So Harriet Quimby, she was able to play both parts. She was flying, but she also was able to maintain some of that femininity when in front of the press. So if anything, she wouldn't get as difficult reporters coming at her for not looking the part or complaining about her appearance. Harriet unfortunately only flew for a year. She died in a plane crash at the Harvard-Boston aviation meet on July 1st, 1912, where she was flying in her Belwa 50 monoplane when she and her co-pilot William Willard were tossed from the aircraft. They plummeted to their deaths. The plane landed unscathed. So while Harriet only flew for 1 year, or really just shy of 1 full year, she inspired many who came after her and really demonstrated to the American women that, hey, this could be possible. This could be something to explore. One of those women was actually NELLIE WILHITE. She actually was the world's, not just America's, but the world's first deaf pilot and the first female to earn her pilot's license in South Dakota. She became deaf at the age of 2 after contracting measles. And like many, especially in the 1920s, there were even more obstacles than there are today. There are still obstacles, but there were even more. And this misconception, this misunderstanding of what people's abilities are. So she was turned away from flight schools until she found one instructor who said, yeah, we can do this. Yeah, let's see if we can do this. So she actually began taking flying lessons in secret. The only person to know that she was taking these lessons was her father, who she nicknamed Pard, P-A-R-D. And if you look closely at this picture, to the right, it says, this certifies that H. Buffington flew with Pard. So Buffington was her instructor and Pard was the name of her plane. She named her plane after her father for his unwavering support. After earning her license, she actually would perform across the country and was known for flower bombing, balloon racing even. So balloons are still, even in the 1920s, still a thing. They are still today, and acrobats. She served as a flight instructor during World War II, and after the war became a commercial pilot. So she actually went on to have a very long aviation career despite being deaf. And she was the first in South Dakota, and she's just inspired many women within South Dakota and the other Plains states to pursue aviation as well. Another woman that I'm sure some of you may have heard of if you're looking and getting your 2023 US quarter, the 25-cent quarter. If it's nice and shiny, take a look at the tails side, and you'll see Bessie Coleman. Bessie Coleman was the first African-American woman to earn her pilot's license. And she did so on June 15th, 1921, 1 year before Amelia Earhart earned her license. And what's interesting is that Bessie, also like Harriet Quimby, went to France to earn that pilot's license. She earned that license at the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, but that was not, I mean, it was after overcoming and experiencing many different obstacles for herself. Bessie was part of what we call the Great Migration. She was born in Waxahachie, Texas, so near kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And her family moved from that part of Texas to Chicago. The Great Migration, as I'm sure many of you already know, was when we saw large numbers of Southern rural African Americans migrating to northern industrial centers like Chicago, like the Twin Cities, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Detroit. And it was during her work as a manicurist in Chicago that she started hearing these stories of American servicemen returning from World War I, our first modern war, and them recounting what it was like to see and hear or themselves fly these planes during the war, and the feeling of freedom and exhilaration. So she's like, I think I can do this too. So she started applying to flight schools and was turned away over and over and over again. Because not only was she a woman, she was a Black woman. And to put this into context, in the 1920s, late teens, 1920s, we're still in 2023 dealing with a lot of what we were dealing with then. We still haven't overcome some of those issues, including that systemic racism. So Bessie, she was about to give up on her dream, but then she met Robert Abbott, who was the editor of the Chicago Defender, a historically Black newspaper. And she told him, I have this goal. I want to open a flight school for other members of our community so that they don't have the same doors shut in their face. If they want to do what we call now a discovery flight, go up with an instructor, they can. So Abbott said, I love this. What do you need? And she's like, well, I could go to France. And he said, great. He paid for her to take French lessons for a year. She went to France in early 1921 and earned that final license in June of that year. She came back to the United States, began barnstorming, and started to really generate a highly respected reputation for herself, for her tenacity, for her showwomanship, if you will, and began using that platform to start taking a stand. If she was performing at a show, an air show in say Texas, in like Dallas, if her family that was still living down there couldn't come through the front gates, Bessie said, I'm not going to participate. So unfortunately, Bessie never got her chance to open that flight school. She died in 1926 during a practice flight, a test flight ahead of a show in Florida. She died in a plane crash. Unfortunately, she and her mechanic had been working on her Curtiss Jenny biplane, and it was discovered after the crash that there was a tool left in the engine compartment that during one of the maneuvers, one of the stunts, became dislodged and irreparably damaged the engine and the compartment, thus them plummeting to their deaths. So while Bessie died at age 34 in a plane crash, never seeing her dream realized, she inspired many, including a woman named Willa Brown, which I'll talk about when we get to World War II. And what Willa Brown was able to do to honor Bessie Coleman, up even until pre-pandemic, 2019, the local chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen would actually have this tradition of flying over Bessie's grave, dropping flowers on her birthday, to honor her for what she was able to do to break down those barriers and those perceptions as well. So Bessie is a story that is undertold in our opinion. And we think that everyone should know Bessie, her story, and what she has meant to countless generations and pilots, as well as astronauts. When Mae Jemison flew to space 31 years ago, she took a picture of Bessie Coleman when Mae Jemison became the first African-American woman in space. So, I mentioned I'm not going to talk about Amelia Earhart a lot because we all know her. She has that name recognition, but Amelia was one of many in the 1920s. We talked about NELLIE WILHITE, we talked about Bessie Coleman, but there were even more women starting to pursue aviation and in flight during the 1920s, including the women in this image here. I apologize for how the scan turned out. Oh, we had to replace a bulb in our scanner. But this picture is actually of just some of the participants from the 1929 Transcontinental Women's Air Derby, which took off from Santa Monica, California, with the finish line in none other than Cleveland, Ohio. In the 1920s, we start to see the emergence of air shows and air races really taking hold here in the United States. And this race in particular, it was the first all-female cross-country air race. And it was important that it ended here in Cleveland because just 4 years prior, what is now Cleveland Hopkins Airport, our major airport, was established. And it was the first modern airport in the country. So it had grandstands, it had state-of-the-art facilities, a state-of-the-art runway even. So some of the women in this picture include Mary Von Mock, who is on the far left of your screen. We have Louise Thaden, who's like dead center there, with standing to the right of Amelia Earhart. And then second from the right of this picture is Clevelander Blanche Noyes. This race was pre-jet engine. This race was before we had the high capacity fuel tanks. So whereas you can hop on a plane and say you're flying out of Boston and you're heading to LAX, you could probably get there in like 6 hours or something, like a nonstop flight. That was not a thing in the 1920s. These women had stops throughout the country. There were about, I believe, 5 women who died during this race. One of the participants, Pancho Barnes, actually got lost and ended up in Mexico. Louise Thaden was, as she was flying between one of the checkpoints, she was realizing that like she's getting a little lightheaded. She's not feeling too well. When she landed, she realized that she was inhaling the exhaust fumes of her engine. So she had to, before taking off for the next day, she had to rig her plane up to make sure that she was getting fresh air into the cockpit there. So this was one of the first races. It became nicknamed the Powder Puff Derby as a way to kind of make fun of the fact that when women got out of their planes, they got out their powder compacts and touched up their appearance. But then they officially adopted the name the Powder Puff Derby. I believe it was in the 40s, to really symbolize, hey, you know what, we own it, and we're still setting speed records and altitude records and distance records during these races. So one of the women, like I said, who is, if you're looking at your screen, second from the right, Blanche Noyes, she was from Cleveland. And Blanche Noyes, with all the various checkpoints throughout the 1929 race, she actually overall did better timing-wise than Amelia Earhart. So she may not have crossed the finish line before Amelia, but on average, the different checkpoints, she did better. So Blanche Noyes actually began taking flying lessons in February of 1929, finished her certification in July of 1929, went home, packed a bag, refueled her plane, and headed out to Santa Monica to turn right back around to participate in that race. And when she got her license, she was one of the first Ohio women to earn that pilot's license. She would actually go on to become a demonstrations pilot for Standard Oil, flew J.D. Rockefeller on his one and only flight, and joined the Air Marking Group and the Bureau of Air Commerce in 1936, and became a member of the Women's Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. By 1936, she also was Louise Thaden, again, the one like right dead center in this image here. Louise and Blanche were co-pilots during the Bendix Trophy race in 36. So we, as the International Women's Air and Space Museum, we have to talk about international women, right? It's not that we have to, but I need to throw in some additional stories here. So when we're looking at the 1930s, there are more planes, more easily accessible, if you will, even with the impact of the Great Depression. The 1920s did see the growth of the aviation world in Europe in particular, because they still bear the scars of World War I. Even today, European countries were investing more funds into aviation than the United States was. But even in the Soviet Union, you see Marina Raskova. She is pictured here with her fellow crew for the Rodina, which means Russia, and the fabled flight of the Rodina in the 1930s. In 1934, Marina Raskova actually began teaching air navigation at the Chukovsky Air Academy, becoming the first instructor at the academy at only age 22. By 35, she was actually competing in a women's cross-country flight in sports planes, flying from what was then Leningrad to Moscow. During the 1930s, Marina, she and Jackie Cochran were kind of toggling back and forth of who had the speed record, who had the distance record, who had the altitude record. So by 1939, with Raskova, Soviet women flyers actually had captured more aviation records than any woman in any other country as well. So with the flight of the Rodina, it's the fabled flight. They got the blessing of Joseph Stalin to try to fly from Moscow all the way to the other side, the far side of Russia. They ran out of fuel. Marina had to parachute out since she was a navigator and they needed to lighten the weight. The other two ended up parachuting out at a later stage. And what resulted was a multi-week countrywide search to find out what happened to these women. All three of them survived. They received the Order of Lenin, and Marina Raskova would actually go on to be the founder of the three all-female bomber regiments during the Second World War. And speaking of World War II, now this entire section, I'm going to breeze through, just fair warning, because we have a whole nother program that we do that drills down very, very deep into women's roles within a World War II aviation. So if you're interested, talk to the library and see if that's something for a future program, if you're interested in that. So women in World War II aviation. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. This was a group of 1,102 women who flew every single type of plane that American servicemen would fly. They ferried planes from factory to Army Air Base or to Naval Base to be put on a carrier. They towed targets for anti-aircraft training maneuvers. They performed administrative flying duties and themselves flew a combined 60 million plus miles during their really two-ish years of service. They were considered civilians. It was not until 1977 that these women were retroactively granted veteran status by President Jimmy Carter, and not until 2010 when they received the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of what they did for the war effort. And again, these women were civilians. They flew domestically. If they were fired on for during towing targets, they could not fire back. Conversely, in the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union had 3 all-female bomber regiments that were active members of the Red Army, one of whom, the 588th, was nicknamed the Night Witches or Nachthexen. These women, they could fire back, and they did, even when they were flying hand-me-down planes, where oftentimes the bomb bay doors would not open. So multiple accounts recall having to take the bombs, reach out over outside the cockpit and drop the bombs by hand. So these women were active parts of the Red Army. 30 of them died during combat, including Marina Raskova. She died shortly after the start of the war, but she went on to train many of these women who would become pilots and fly during the war on the Eastern Front. In Great Britain, we can actually credit Great Britain with the model that we had for the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. Again, these were all civilian crews. These were co-ed squads as well. They were not assigned to any particular RAF squadron or anything, but there were 164 women, 25 of whom were American, a handful of Canadian as well, because we need to remember, before the US actually declared war was happening over in Europe and in Great Britain. So Jackie Cochran was one who actually, for a short time, flew with the ATA to really find out how did they make this work. These women flew virtually every type of plane that the RAF did, and sometimes even only had 15 minutes to learn the ins and outs of this new plane that they were to be charged with, and getting it from point A to point B. Willa Brown, she was part of the Civil Air Patrol, which is still even around today. It has a slightly different focus, but during World War II, the Civil Air Patrol was established to oversee our domestic airports. And Willa Brown actually was the founder of the Coffey School of Aeronautics at the Harlem Airport outside Chicago. And she is the one who I mentioned saw Bessie Coleman's dream realized by opening that flight school. Willa Brown was the first commissioned officer in the Illinois Civil Air Patrol, and she actually successfully petitioned the U.S. government to integrate the Army Air Corps during World War II. She herself would actually train over 200 men who would go on and qualify and fly with the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. Because that was one of the requirements of the Civil Air Patrol, was provide additional flight hours and opportunities for pilots to qualify to fly with the Army Air Corps or with the Navy. So Willa Brown, she actually started the tradition originally of flying over Bessie's grave and dropping flowers in honor of her birthday. And Willa Brown finally sits next to Bessie Coleman in the National Aviation Hall of Fame because she was enshrined in September of 2022. So we're very excited for Willa there. But like I said, I just breezed through World War II because we have an entire program just on that, where we talk about manufacturing, we talk about the Civil Air Patrol, we talk about the waves and the WAC and the spars and so many other areas in which women had a huge role in. So that's why I'm breezing through that. Again, just reminding everyone. And it's important to understand, we started in the 18th century, we're into the mid 20th century. We're covering a lot of time, so please hang in there. We're almost done. But women in space, we could not get to our current space program without the the breaking of barriers and the inspirational women who began within aviation. And it's important to understand that women, again, have been a part of our space program since its inception, since its beginning. One woman in particular was Mary Golda Ross, who she herself was born in 1908 in Oklahoma, near the capital of the Cherokee Nation. She is Cherokee. After high school, she graduated from Northeastern State Teachers College with a degree in mathematics. She taught in the public schools for about 10 years before pursuing a master's from what is now the University of Northern Colorado. During World War II, she actually began a job as a computer at the Lockheed Corporation and was assigned to fixing the design problems of the P-38 Lightning aircraft. She analyzed data, did calculations, and when the war ended, she was actually sent to attend the University of California at LA, UCLA, by Lockheed, who paid for her to get certified as an engineer. And by 1952, she joined Lockheed's Skunk Works, the top secret think tank, where she was the founding engineer and the only woman on the team. She would work on the Lockheed's Missile and Space Company, formed during the Cold War, on the Agena rockets that were used during the Corona reconnaissance satellite launches and during the Gemini program. She was one of the authors of NASA's Planetary Flight Handbook, number 3, and an author of, what it would be like to travel to Mars and Venus as well. After retiring from NASA at age 65, she became one of the founding members of the National Museum of the American Indian and spent the rest of her life advocating for and encouraging Native American youth to pursue engineering and the sciences. So she's highlighted in our newest exhibit, Quest for the Stars. And I will admit, I knew nothing of her until we started working on that exhibit. I'm like, wait a second, we need to share her story and those like her. Another group of women in our early space program were what we now call the Mercury 13. This was a group of women who, not sanctioned by NASA, not endorsed by NASA. NASA wanted nothing to do with women in the space program in 1960, 1961. They underwent the same astronaut tests as men like John Glenn, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and the whole motley crew of the Mercury 7. These women were skilled pilots. Many of them had more airtime than the men in the Mercury 7. And they had more experience on different planes as well. They passed every single test with flying colors. Unfortunately, NASA said, nope, not interested. Even after congressional hearings, NASA determined and stated they were only recruiting military test pilots. So this group of women, even after lobbying for congressional hearings, having their voices heard, were told, we're not interested. It was not until July 20th, 2021, that one of the members of this group of women, the Mercury 13, got her chance to fly to space. At age 82, Wally Funk, who in this bottom picture, she is the second from the left. She's the only one wearing a NASA shirt. Wally Funk got her chance to finally go to space at age 82, beating John Glenn's record at the time. And she is the oldest woman to have gone to space. She flew aboard the commercial company Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket. The first woman in space was Valentina Tereshkova. She is still alive. 60 years ago this year, she became the first woman to go to space, and she was a parachutist. She was recruited specifically because the cosmonauts were expected to eject from their capsule and parachute down separately. And because she was a gifted parachutist, she was recruited specifically for that purpose. She never told her mom that she was going to space. Her mom had to find out by listening to the radio like everybody else. So we tell kids, make sure that your parents know what you're doing. But Valentina still remains the only woman to solo orbit the Earth. Annie Easley was in 1954 new to Cleveland. And everyone has heard, hopefully, you've read the book or watched the movie Hidden Figures. Annie Easley was one of Cleveland's hidden figures. When she began her career in 1955 at what is now NASA's Glenn Research Center, she began before NASA was even NASA. She began the same year that Neil Armstrong started his career as a NASA test pilot as well. She would do many of the computations, plot data by hand using a calculator the size of a desk. I'm a historian. I don't like math, so I'm glad that she got to work on that. But when machine computers were added to the job, she retrained herself to ensure that she could still do her job. She worked on the launch vehicles group with a software engineering team, and she would actually work on the Upper Centaur rockets and part of the Gemini program. There are still some folks that work at NASA's Glenn Research Center that when they began their careers in the 80s, they were in Annie's department. And it's so interesting to hear their stories and their recollections of this remarkable woman. And when she retired in 1989, after about 34 years, all she said was, "I'm so grateful to have seen all the things that we can do." So she is a remarkable person in our early space program. Another woman, another group here, and I think this is going to be one of the last ones that I touch on, is the class of 1978. This was the first class recruited specifically for our shuttle program in the 1980s. And we have Anna Fisher, no relation to me, but Anna Fisher, she in 1984 was assigned to her one and only shuttle flight, STS-51A. And when she launched during this 8-day mission, the crew deployed 2 satellites and retrieved 2 satellites from an irregular orbit. What's interesting is that she had a medical background. She was not a pilot. All of the women in the class of 78 were scientists. And when Anna Fisher launched, she was the first mother in space. So remember that on Mother's Day, is that Anna Fisher became the first mother in space and was a big part in helping to understand the medical implications of being in space for longer periods of time. Mae Jemison, we talked about her briefly. She was the first African-American woman to go to space during the shuttle era. So she was in orbit for about 7 to 8 days. She was recruited in the first class after the Challenger explosion in '86. And she was also a medical doctor. The pop quiz trivia question that we always share for Mae Jemison is one that she's continued her mission to encourage young people to explore space and get back to space. And she also was the first real life astronaut to have a guest appearance on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Sunny Williams is where we start to see a NASA astronaut working with NASA's commercial partners. Sunny Williams is a naval helicopter pilot. She actually was aboard the USS Saipan when she found out that she was selected as a NASA astronaut in 1993. And she's actually going to be a part of the upcoming Boeing Starliner first crewed mission to launch here in the next few months, actually. So we're starting to see this cooperation between our commercial crews and NASA. And then finally here, Kayla Barron. Kayla Barron has actually been named to the Artemis program, which is going to get women and African Americans and our populations back to the moon and landing on a new part of the moon as well. She is actually a commissioned naval officer and a nuclear submariner. She flew for her first time to the International Space Station. I forgot to update this slide. She actually came back from the International Space Station, I believe, in April of 2022. So I forgot about this slide. But she could be the first woman on the moon. We don't know. So there's so much happening and so many new opportunities, different skill sets that NASA, ESA, Canadian Space Agency, and others are looking for. And that's one of the things that we enjoy exploring at the museum. But I know that we're running pretty low on time. But if you have any questions, you can shoot us an email. If you're in Ohio, we'd love to welcome you. But let's open up the questions here. See what we have.
Thank you for that. So we have a few questions. Why was France the place for women to get their pilot's license? What other countries gave women the same opportunity?
That is a fabulous question. So one of the things about France was, I don't want to say that they were more open, but they had like the French like empire too. So they were more or less accepting than in the United States. But also, if you think about it, even within that first decade of modern flight after 1903 with the Wright brothers, European countries were picking up aviation and running with it. That's a really bad like metaphor, but you kind of get the idea. Especially in the 1920s, late 19 teens, 1920s, you start to see France investing a lot of their money into aviation. So they had more sophisticated planes, more diverse planes. Especially in the 1920s, for every 20 planes that France had, the US had one. So there was more opportunity there as well for planes to be used as well. So that's a very good question.
Thank you. And I think this question might have been in reference to the International Women Pilots. Question was, what was the plane she flew for the oil company? And I wonder if you had a picture.
Yes. So I believe Deborah asked that question. I cannot remember off the top of my head the plane that Blanche Noyes, I believe, is who you're referring to, the Clevelander Blanche Noyes. I cannot remember which plane she flew, but if you send us an email at info@iwasm.org, I will get our collections manager to see if we have a picture of it, because I know we have pictures of it. I just can't remember which plane it was.
I think that's all the time we have today. We have lots of wonderful comments. Thank you. It was a very interesting program. Thank you for a great program. Love this presentation. Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating program. I just want to thank you, Sara, for a fabulous presentation in honor of Women's History Month and helping to make all women who have made an impact in air and space visible. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight on this cold March evening. I will be sending a recap with a link to the recording, and I will include Sara's email if you have any other questions that you didn't think of. Thank you again,
Wonderful.
Sara.
No problem. Thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Stay warm and safe.